A few versions ago, Illustrator introduced the new 3D tool, a big step up from the clunky old 3D effect we had before. This new 3D tool uses a physically based rendering workflow, also known as PBR, which is nothing new for those who already work with 3D, but an exciting thing for us to have available inside Illustrator. However, working with PBR has both a positive and a negative side. The good news is that the PBR workflow is extremely realistic. Objects, textures, and lights behave how they are supposed to in the real world. Objects can be metallic, shiny, rough, and have textures that create depth through shadows and reflections. The bad news is that it is also very intensive on your computer, since it uses a lot of textures and renders using ray tracing, which is also what makes it look so realistic. And let's say that, performance-wise, Illustrator is not the best software out there for working with 3D. Working with PBR textures also require you to understand a little bit of 3D terminology if you want the best results. It's better and easier for you if you understand what properties like roughness and normals mean, and having a little understanding of how textures and shaders work also won't hurt. This can all seem very intimidating. The panel itself has a million sliders and menus and buttons to press, but don't worry, you'll get it all sorted out by the end of this video, okay? Okay. Now, let's tame this beast. Everything starts by opening the 3D and Materials panel through the Window menu. This is a pretty big panel. It has a lot of tabs and options to scroll through. So I actually advise you to dock this panel on the right side and keep it expanded, to make use of as much screen space as you can. The panel itself is divided into 3 tabs: Object, Material, and Lighting. The Object tab is where you can customize the shape of your 3D object, add bevels to the edges, and change the rotation. Materials is where you can apply one of the default materials, customize their properties to change how they look, or download and import new materials. These are all from Substance 3D, a set of tools for creating 3D materials that was bought by Adobe in 2019. Oh, and since I know materials can be very intimidating, Patreon supporters will get access to this Illustrator file with a custom selection of my favorite materials and all the different ways you can use them. Everything saved as graphic styles so you can apply them with just one click. You can support for only $2 a month, and the link is in the description. And lastly, we have the Lighting tab, which is where you can add and customize light sources, change their position and intensity, and add shadows to your object. Now, let's break down each one into detail. To get started, we need an object selected. This can be anything, any shape, a rectangle, a circle, a star, or even a group of shapes, like an illustration. But bear in mind that the more complex your shapes are, the more intensive the 3D process will be. Then, on the Object tab, we have 4 different types of 3D objects: Plane, Extrude, Revolve, and Inflate. Plane is the most basic of them all. It doesn't actually create a 3D object. You can see that it doesn't add any depth, but rather it allows you to rotate the object inside a 3-dimensional space. So it's very good for creating backgrounds that work as a wall or a floor to place other 3D objects. In a 3D space, you can rotate objects in 3 different axes: X, Y, or Z. X rotates along the width, Y rotates along the height, and Z rotates along the depth. You can rotate the object either dragging the sliders in the panel or by using the symbol that appears on the center of the object, which can be more intuitive. However, use the one you feel most comfortable with. It's a little bit finicky to rotate stuff in 3D. The addition of a 3rd dimension really makes things way harder, so please, don't get frustrated, we're all on the same boat. A good starting point is to use one of the presets in the drop-down menu. Most of the time, you will find there the rotation you're looking for. Finally, you can also add or remove perspective. Adding perspective makes it look more realistic, but removing it makes it more stylized. Extruding is probably what most people picture when they think of 3D. It's perhaps the most classic 3D effect. In practical terms, extruding is basically adding depth to a flat 2D object, which is exactly what the first slider does. As you drag the slider, it increases the depth of the object. The twist slider literally twists the object along its depth, and the taper slider tapers the object, which means to reduce in thickness towards the end. Combining all 3 sliders, we can make a screw. Below the taper slider, we have the option to add or remove the cap, making the object appear solid or hollow. Then we have the option to turn on bevels. You can select the bevel shape in the drop-down menu and then play with the sliders, increasing the width and the height to get the bevel to the size you want, or adding multiple steps and playing with their spacing. On the bottom, you can invert the bevel so it goes inwards and also add the bevel to both sides. And yes, this is very cool to play with, the possibilities are endless, and I did waste quite a bit of time having fun here. A good trick is to add a very small round bevel to the object to get a reflection of light, making it look more realistic. The next one is Revolve, and it requires a different workflow. Revolve takes a path you draw and sweeps it in a circle. Effectively, what you want to do is to draw a half silhouette of the desired shape and let Illustrator do the hard work. So for example, if we want to make a chest pawn, we can simply draw this path and apply the revolve effect. If the resulting shape is completely not what you had in mind, it's because Illustrator doesn't know if it's the right or the left side of the object, so you can change that in the drop-down menu. Other than that, you can change the revolve angle, which determines how many degrees will the initial path revolve. So if you set this to 360, it'll go a full circle, and anything less than that will leave a gap in the object. You can also offset the initial path from the center of the mesh, creating a circular gap in the middle. Twist and taper are also there, and they can create some very interesting shapes. But making anything that is not an abstract blob is a little beyond my skills, so I'll humbly leave that to the 3D pros. And finally, we have Inflate, which is, in my opinion, the most fun to play with. Inflate gives a balloon effect to your object, which is quite suggestive by the icon. Effectively, you only need to worry about the last slider, which controls the volume. Think of it as how much air is being added inside your object. The depth slider adds depth just like in the extrude mode, but the depth added will be flat and won't be affected by the inflation, so it's not always that useful. Same thing with taper and twist, they will only affect the depth of the object. Despite being simple to use, Inflate can give you some very cool results in very few clicks, especially if you make some adjustments in the lighting, which is our next topic. I purposefully skipped the Materials tab for now because it is the most complex one, but we'll get there, don't worry. The Lighting tab is definitely more simple than the Object tab, and it only has two sections, Light and Shadows. But simple does not mean easy. Working with lights in a full-fledged 3D software is already a challenge, even for seasoned users, and the clumsy interface and poor performance in Illustrator does not help at all. But with a little bit of practice, you can get the hang of it. At the top of the Lighting tab, you have a few lighting presets, but we'll skip them for now. Let's first understand which aspects of the lighting they are changing. All the parameters you can change for the lighting are very self-explaining. At the very top, you can add a color to your light, something that is very fun and you should definitely mess around. But using white light is by far the easiest option. Then we can change the intensity of the light. Think of this as how many watts is the lamp that is lighting the scene. And be careful not to push the intensity too far, because the colors can start to clip and have that ugly overexposed look. Then we have rotation and height, but these ones are much easier to explain with shadows turned on. So let's do this by toggling the switch for shadows. Enabling shadows is such an important step, because it won't just cast shadows on the floor. It will also cast shadows and reflections on the 3D object itself, making the lighting much more realistic. Look at this comparison between shadows off and on with the exact same lighting settings. The difference is night and day. And since we're here, let's understand the very few options we have for shadows. First, we can change the position of the shadows, either below or behind the object. Think of this as, is your object on the floor or on a wall? Then we have two sliders. Distance from object, which literally adds distance between the object and the shadow, giving the impression that the object is floating. And shadow bounds, which is used to control how far from the object Illustrator will render the shadows. The maximum amount of 400% is very often not enough, and we end up having to change the lighting of the object because we get this ugly hard edge to appear. I hope they increase this in the future, but I do understand that this limitation is there because of performance. Now that we have shadows turned on, it's much easier to understand the position of the light. Think of rotation as the direction in which our object will cast a shadow, and height as how far this shadow will be cast. After adjusting the intensity and the position of our lighting, we can control how soft it is. The changes in softness can only be seen after the object is rendered, so I'm going to turn rendering on. Don't worry, we'll take a look at rendering later in the video. Softness controls how diffused our light is, but we can also think of it in terms of shadows. A soft light will create very soft shadows, which are shadows with very undefined shape and blurred edges. Observe how you basically cannot tell what the object is just from the shadows. A hard light, on the other hand, that is, a light with less softness, will create a very defined shadow with crisp edges. Observe how you can have a much better idea of the shape of the object just from looking at the shadows. A hard light will also be more intense than a soft light, so as you reduce the softness, you might want to reduce the intensity as well. Observe that the shadow being cast on the floor is not the only one affected by softness. The shadow cast on the object itself changes as well. It's important to understand that these two kinds of lighting will give completely different looks to your 3D object. A hard light makes it look like the object is under a bright sunlight, enhancing the shape of the object and giving it more definition, while a soft light looks more like a studio light. It looks more professional, but also more artificial. If we change the temperature of these lights to warm or cold, we can push this perception even further. So, choose your lights wisely. Oh, and you might have noticed that at the very top we have this sort of interactive lighting simulation where you can click and drag the light source to reposition it. I find this to be way harder than just moving the slider, but hey, whatever floats your boat. If you find this better than the sliders, feel free to use it. Below this, you also have a list of your light sources, and you can add multiple lights by clicking on the plus button. To edit each one, just select them on the list and customize them as you normally would. Okay, now let's move to the big star of the day, materials. When working with materials, you have two main options, either the base material or materials from Adobe Substance. And there are big differences between these two, in performance, looks, and customizability. This is perhaps a little complicated, but I'll try to explain it as simple as I can. The default material is just a simple shader. Think of a shader as a small program that tells your computer how the object should look. They can control things like the color of the object, how shiny it is, if it is metallic or not, and in more robust 3D softwares, they can even realistically simulate surfaces like skin or glass, through properties such as subsurface scattering or transmission. But you don't need to worry about that, because the base material in Illustrator only has three properties: color, roughness, and metallic. The color of the object will be defined by the color you choose on the color panel. There is not much mystery, just pick the color you want. But it's worth mentioning that it does allow you to use gradients and patterns, and there's a very cool trick to improve performance that I'll show you later on. On the 3D panel at the very bottom, you have two sliders, one for roughness and one for metallic. Roughness controls how shiny the object is, but since rough is the opposite of shiny, the slider works inverted as well. So if you set the slider to 0, it will be completely reflective, almost like a mirror. And as you increase the value, it gets less and less reflective, until it eventually becomes completely unreflective. The word used is roughness because it simulates how rough the surface of the object is, going from a very smooth surface like plastic at 0, all the way to a very rough surface like brick or concrete at 1. Then we have metallic, which controls, well, how metallic the object is. At 0 it is completely non-metallic, and at 1 it is completely metal. Play around with these two sliders and the color until you get the look you want. Just from these three parameters, you can get a wide variety of different looks. The good side of using this base material, which only uses a simple shader, is that it has good performance, so your object will render faster and Illustrator is less likely to crash. The downside is that the shader will be applied equally to the entire object. If it is shiny all the way through. If it is metallic, it is metallic all the way through. So you would have a hard time creating, for example, a scratched metal material, where the parts that are scratched are not as shiny as the parts that are smooth, or even trying to add depth to the scratches to make them look more realistic. This is not a problem for all these other materials, because they combine two very special things: shaders and textures. Textures allow shaders to be applied in a very specific way. I'm gonna show you how. A very important observation first. You don't need to use or download any textures or shaders to work with these materials. I'm just showing you the behind the scenes of how they work, so you can understand what you're doing. And pro tip, this is what separates beginners from professionals. The most basic texture is a color texture. Let's say we want to make scratched metal, like I said before. Instead of just selecting the color gray in our shader, we can plug this texture here. Now, instead of painting the object gray, the shader will apply the texture. Sweet. Now, let's make it more like metal. Let's apply a metalness texture to the metallic property. This is a different kind of texture, because it's only black and white. This texture tells the shader where to apply the metallic property and with which intensity. It works just like a mask in Photoshop, for example. The shader will be applied with less intensity where the texture is dark and with more intensity where the texture is light. Perfect. But this metal is looking more like concrete than metal, and that's because it's lacking a roughness texture. And the roughness texture works the same way. It tells the shader where the object should be shiny and how shiny it should be. Okay, now this is looking like metal. But still, this metal is looking very smooth for a scratched metal. And this is where the normal texture comes in. You don't need to fully understand how normals work, but know that a normal is the name given to the direction in which light is reflected, like up, down, left, or right. And this special purple texture tells the shader in which direction to reflect the light at every single point of the object, creating a fake depth in the object. And they can add so much realism with just a single texture. So just keep this in mind. Normals equal depth. And wow, look at this. This looks so much like a real sphere made out of scratched metal. Let's see every step again, a little bit closer. Color, metallic, roughness, and finally, normals. This is what's happening under the hood when you select a material from Adobe Substance. One of the apps of the Substance subscription is called Substance Designer, which is where you can procedurally generate all these textures that I've shown you. Again, you don't need to buy this app or even know how to use it, but this is how materials like these are made. Now, the thing about all these materials from Substance is that I cannot explain what each slider does. First, because there are dozens of sliders for each material, and second, because each material has different properties, and hence, different sliders. But I can show you some standard properties that all materials have. At the very top, you will always see the resolution, which you can use to reduce or increase the resolution of the textures. Just beware, this can cause rendering times to go up or even Illustrator to crash, depending on your computer. Below resolution, you have repeat, which you can use to scale the texture up or down. If the texture looks too big for your object, increase the repeat value. On the bottom of the material properties, there will always be a position and a technical parameters section on every material. And hey, there's a slider to control the intensity of normals there. Yeah, that's why I showed you what normals are. If the material you're selecting has any kind of depth, like bumps, scratches, or dents, chances are you can control the intensity of the depth by using the normal intensity slider. Observe how the bumps almost disappear on this texture when we drag the slider to the left. And the opposite happens if we drag it to the right. On the technical parameters section, you can also change some basic color properties of the material, like brightness, contrast, hue, and saturation. On the position section, you can reposition the texture, changing the Y and X position or rotating it. And since we're looking into this particular material, let's see if we can find another texture from our previous example. And yup, here it is. We have a slider to control the roughness. Let's drag it to the left to make the material shiny, and would you look at that? They are using a texture to control where it's shiny and how shiny it is, just like I showed you before. Notice how there are some spots in the material that are not reflecting the light, because the texture is preventing the shader to be applied to the whole object. The good side of using materials from Substance is that they are very realistic and have lots of options to customize. You can create a lot of different looks from just a single material. The downside is that, since they use so many textures and shaders, they are way more intensive on your computer. You have to pay a lot of attention when working with these materials, because Illustrator will crash if you're not careful. I'll show you some tips to improve performance at the end of the video. But talking about performance, there is something you can do to apply textures to the base material and mix a little bit of both worlds, a little bit of realism and a good performance. Since you can use patterns from the swatches panel as the base color of your 3D object, here's what you're gonna do. Go to ANDYTELLSTHINGS or any other website where you can download free textures. Pick and choose the one you want. I'm gonna use this marble texture here, and hey, it was made with Substance. Now, download the texture pack and drag the color texture file inside Illustrator. Select the linked image and click on Embed on the control bar. Open the swatches panel and drag the image inside. Now you've added this image as a pattern swatch. Just select your 3D object and apply the pattern. If the pattern is too big on the object, press S to select the scale tool, hit Enter to open the menu, uncheck Transform Object, and scale down the pattern as much as you like. Then you can adjust the roughness of the material to match the texture you're using. For this marble texture, I want very low roughness. And there you go, a realistic texture with very good performance. Cool trick, huh? Now let's move on to rendering. Rendering is fairly simple. You can turn it on or off by pressing this button on the top right corner of the 3D panel. But to get more options, we can press this little arrow on the side. You basically have two rendering options: wireframe or ray tracing. Wireframe is basically a skeletal 3D model, where you can only see lines and vertices. I don't know how accurate this is to the actual mesh of the 3D object being generated, but it's still kinda cool looking. Ray tracing is a little more interesting, because it is the rendering method you would see on hyper-realistic 3D images and CGI. With ray tracing, we have three quality options, but be very careful with this. High quality render on complex 3D objects will cause Illustrator to crash if your computer isn't good enough. Though it's worth noting that from low to high quality, the difference is quite notable, especially with reflections. Low quality rendering tends to have very noisy and undefined reflections, while high quality makes them very smooth. On the side we have a warning saying quality also depends on the resolution setting document raster effect settings, with a shortcut to open the raster effect settings. This is the resolution it's referring to. This will affect not only 3D objects, but also any other raster effect, like drop shadows and glows. Be very careful when changing this, because all 3D objects will be updated at once, so it's very easy to cause a crash. My computer usually can't handle more than 72 dpi for most cases. Though, of course, if you're making a design that will be printed, the preferred resolution is 300 dpi. Below the quality settings, you have an option to reduce the noise, which you should always leave checked. It not only makes the rendering look way better, it is also way faster. The render as a vector option is kind of a weird one. It will generate a wireframe of your object, rasterize the shadows, and create this image here. I'm not sure what this image is. It's not rasterized because it doesn't pixelate when you zoom, but it's also not a gradient mesh. I honestly don't know. Lastly, we have the Remember and Apply to All option, which will update all 3D objects at once and also keep this as the standard render settings for future objects. Again, be careful. If you have too many objects in your scene, this can cause a crash. 3D in Illustrator is intensive. Work with it long enough and Illustrator will crash, or at the very least, freeze. So here are some tips to improve the performance. If you just want to move a 3D object, close or collapse the 3D panel, so it won't load all the properties. It makes a huge difference. Don't change material settings with rendering turned on. Now, this one depends. Some materials are more intensive than others on the computer, but be careful either way. Don't use rendering quality, material resolution, or raster effects resolution higher than needed. If you're making images for the web, keep raster effects at 72 dpi. If the object looks fine, keep the rendering quality at low. If the material doesn't look pixelated, keep the resolution at 1024 pixels. Heck, even lower it and see how it looks. If you're 100% finished on working on a 3D object, you can always rasterize it and turn it into an image. You can do that by going to the Object menu and choosing Rasterize. And be very, very careful when using the Remember and Apply to All option in the rendering options. If you enjoyed this video, check this other one here. I think you'll like it. Thank you to all my patrons who help me make high quality content like this one. Check the links in the description if you want to support the channel. And don't forget to like and subscribe. If you have any doubts, leave a comment down below and I'll answer it. Thank you so much for watching and have a great day. Bye!